Good evening and welcome to the Canberra AWS user group. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're presenting from, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So welcome back to the Canberra AWS user group for another month. We're here for April 2022. We've refreshed the look and feel on the slides. And I've left my iPad unmuted so I can hear an echo of my voice at the back of the room, which is just working fantastically. Tech issues. You'd think it would have it right by now. But anyway, let's progress. This evening, what are we going to be covering off? We're going to be going through our usual run of what's new in AWS. We'll be talking about some of the recently released white papers, if you like to nerd out on written words. And then the main presentation this evening is myself and JJ going through a slight format change. I suppose we wanted to do a bit of a session with lots of little interesting things as opposed to big grandiose ideas. And so we'll be talking about our AWS life hacks. But before that, let's get into the usual intro materials, starting with our YouTube channel. We're up to 73 subscribers on this. I would very much like to make it to 100 and change that URL to something that humans might actually remember. So if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel, we have a couple of years worth of backlog on there of all of the presentations, so you can go and watch stuff again, share the links around with friends and colleagues, and enjoy more of the goodness that is the Canberra AWS user group. So things that are new this month. So far, 108 new features and updates have been released this month, which on our running chart, since we've been running the user group here, looks a little bit like this. So you can start to see we're trending back up after the quiet Christmas break. But let's go through some of the highlights for April 2022. The first one I wanted to talk about is an update to Amazon Athena, in that it now has support for querying Amazon Ion data. So Ion, if you've not heard of it, is an open source data format that Amazon created that is self-describing and super usable in a number of different text and binary-based contexts. Right now, it gets used internally by AWS in quite a lot of places. We use it in the Quantum Ledger database system, and also if you've looked at our open source SQL system, Particle, it's also heavily used there as well. Now you can take data that is stored in Ion and query it directly from Amazon Athena. So that's great. Next, AWS Security Hub has had more updates. So there's now 5 new controls to ensure security across different features in AWS, as well as a new integration partner. So if you're already using Security Hub, these new controls, if you've got it enabled to add them automatically, will just start looking in your account and telling you about security issues it finds. So the new controls are related to, there's a couple of S3 ones, a load balancer one, a Cloudfront one, and they're all automatically added there for you. So it's a really great example of how you benefit without having to make any actual changes. You get additional security checks for nothing. And Data Theorem was the new partner. So again, part of a rich ecosystem of partners who are feeding data into Security Hub to give you that single pane of glass view of security across your AWS organization. Next, AWS Single Sign-On has launched configurable synchronization for Microsoft Active Directory. So previously, if you had connected AWS SSO to your Microsoft Active Directory, it grabbed all user identities and made them available in AWS SSO. Now, this was based on customer feedback, not something that all of our customers wanted. Now you can configure which users and groups are synchronized to SSO, so you don't need to bring the entire directory across with you. So this lets you be very specific about it and keep just the users and groups that matter in SSO, so you can work with that subset. Next, a couple of updates that relate to the Amazon FSx services. So the first one is that Amazon FSx for OpenZFS is now available in a couple of different regions, including Sydney. So if you're a user of OpenZFS, which is a really high-performance Linux file system, you can now take advantage of that through the Amazon FSx service, which means it's fully managed, it's scaled for you, availability is managed for you. But applications that depend on that specific file system, you can still bring them and use them in exactly the same way because it's natively running an OpenZFS file system. So I believe we saw the numbers here. You can go up to 1 million IOPS and latencies in the order of hundreds of milliseconds to be able to go through and get to the data that you've got there. Also, the other FSx update is for Lustre. So we released that a little while back, but we've released a new generation of that you can take advantage of in the Sydney region as well. Now, what's driving this is actually the AWS Graviton 2 processors. So because we've switched it over to Graviton, we've been able to make some great performance improvements, such as a 5 times improvement, up to a 5 times improvement in throughput, as well as a number of other benefits to the overall performance of the system. So if you've been using Amazon FSx for Lustre, definitely go and check this one out and take advantage of those performance enhancements that you see as a result of AWS Graviton. Next, for Amazon SageMaker. So the serverless inference feature is now generally available. So this is one that was released in preview at reInvent last year. Essentially, what you did before this feature, when you wanted to release an inference endpoint for your machine learning models, is you had to decide how much infrastructure and how you would scale it to be able to run that endpoint. Now, that didn't necessarily suit inferences that were sporadic in their use and really inconsistent, because you had to pay for the availability of that infrastructure, regardless of whether or not you were using it. Now, with serverless inference, you're able to pay just for the time that you're running inferences, billed per millisecond. So very similar to the way that we do AWS Lambda. So you can now set these up and not have to worry about that underlying infrastructure and how it scales and how you're going to manage the costs of that. You can just pay for what you use, and it's generally available for all SageMaker users. This is one from last month's presentation. AWS IoT Twin Maker is now generally available. So it's been in preview for a little while there, and we've now made it generally available. If you haven't seen last month's presentation, you won't see it on the YouTube channel yet because I've been very, very slack and haven't done that yet. So that's my bad, but I will get that there. We've got the recording. And if you want to check out more about Twin Maker, definitely go and have a look at that session. Next is another one for Amazon Athena. So there's been 10 new data source connectors that have been added into Athena. So these new data source connectors are for a bunch of different external systems. So things like Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, Teradata was in there, Azure Synapse, Google, their Big Data Lake, and a bunch of different other ones can all be directly queried now from Amazon Athena. So this makes Athena a really great place to be able to aggregate multiple different data sources into a single place where you can query all of the data and then connect it off to other external systems. So Athena really forms a really key part of customer solutions for data lakes. And with these additional connectors, you can now bring in even more data than ever before. And the last couple that I wanted to touch on tonight was, so this one, Amazon Aurora Serverless V2 is now generally available. So Amazon Aurora is our database engine that's compatible with Postgres and MySQL. And Aurora Serverless is designed to really optimize how you pay and operate an Aurora database by separating the compute and the storage components. Now, version 2 of Aurora Serverless scales almost instantly to respond to traffic coming into your database server. It can go up to hundreds of thousands of requests per second within a fraction of a second. So that kind of scaling is phenomenally fast and means that you really are only going to be paying for the compute time that you actually need. So this can result in savings of up to 90% compared to paying for provisioned capacity of a database engine. So if you have relational database requirements and they can work in Postgres or MySQL, definitely it's a good time to go and check out what Amazon Aurora can do for you. And lastly, an update to Amazon Quicksite. So Quicksite's our kind of BI tool. It does visualizations of data and dashboards and lets users interact with data in really interesting visual ways. Now there's a new feature where I can one click to embed these visualizations within external web pages. So if I wanted to embed visualizations from Quicksite into like a wiki page, for example, or a public website, you can go through and do that now really, really easily directly within the Quicksite dashboard. All right, so in terms of white papers this month, there's been a handful that have been updated. 3 that were worth calling out, I thought, were updates. So we've got the tagging best practices white paper has been updated. The AWS best practices for DDoS resiliency. That one's a really good read if you're interested in how to protect public-facing websites against DDoS attacks. And one that comes up from time to time as well is GDPR compliance. This one, again, has been updated with the latest information and guidance. But with that out of the way, we're going to kick on into the main presentation. And rather than start that myself, I'm going to hand over to JJ. So let's get into it.
G'day everyone. As Brian said, this is a bit of an experimental way we're structuring the talks tonight. So what you'll get is effectively a series of lightning talks out of us about some of the features and some of the releases that have happened since reInvent that are some of the little things that just make life better. For me, I think about them as kind of like a set of Bluetooth headphones. We're still doing the same work we used to do, except that it's just so much easier. So headphones, they still play the same music. I don't have a cord getting tangled. All of these things we're diving into are little things that have been released that have just helped make work we do on AWS that bit easier and remove some of what we like to call at AWS the undifferentiated heavy lifting of running your AWS environment. Now, the talk will be in a series of areas. You'll see Brian and I sort of tag team in and out a bit as we go through this. It'll be a bit of a mix of some demo work as well as just some slideware as well. We're super keen on feedback for this. So let us know as you go through what you've liked, what you don't like, and if we think there's this sort of talk would be something that you'd like to hear a bit more out ongoing. So, to get straight into it, into the management and governance space, there's been a few releases in organisations and Control Tower that if you're part of a cloud management team or a cloud engineering team, just make life that little bit easier. So the first of those is managing alternate contacts. So for a long time, whenever you created a new AWS account in your best practice multi-account environment, you had to manually go into the account and update the alternate contact information. Now, there's a bunch of blogs and publications from us about why that's important. I won't go into that tonight. But what's been released since is the ability to manage those from a central place. So it's sure they're lining up with our best practice. And also a part of that, now from your organisation, you can actually manage the end-to-end account lifecycle. So not only will Control Tower now create your accounts and have the account factories you want, but you can use organisations to actually close the accounts from a central point as well. And it just saves a bunch more clicks to get that done. And what I'll do is I'll actually demonstrate how that works for you in a little bit. And the last couple of things in this category I wanted to mention was around region denies, and I'll dive into the bit more detail about that shortly and some of the nested OU work in Control Tower as well. So without further ado, let's get into a bit of a demo. So what you'll see here is our test organisation that we've got set up. And you can see here, as I mentioned, Control Tower now supports nested OUs. So what you'll actually find up here is you have got a whole bunch of nested we've just put some simple nested OUs to manage a basic account that we've got. And what this allows you to do is further organise your accounts in your organisation in ways that just make a bit more logical sense. Previously in Control Tower, you could only go one deep. But to manage the alternate contacts, we actually just go into our account and we look at the contact info. And unfortunately, Brian and I use reverse scroll settings, so you're going to watch a bunch of uncoordinated scrolling from me tonight because I'm on his laptop. But our operations contact, you can now just set it here. You can set it in the console. Now, this might be Mr. Super Smart Operations guy, and he's ops@company.com, and phone number is plus blah, 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 blah. Super easy. And equally, you can do that with your billing contact, which might be Mrs. Billing, etc. So I won't go through all of those now, but you can see from here that rather than having to go and find get credentials for the other account, log in and go through the different parts of the console, you can now manage all of them centrally much, much easier. So if you've still got a team that's manually going around and updating those contact details, this is certainly a great first step to help make that a lot easier. Now, the other part that we mentioned was closing an account. Now, it's important to note here that the closing of accounts, you still need to unmanage it out of Control Tower if you're a Control Tower customer. Because that takes quite some time, I've pre-done that for the purposes of this demonstration. So this account here used to be a Control Tower provisioned account. I've unmanaged it from Control Tower, and so now it's just in the root OU of my organisation. And so now to close it, I can just go in there and close the account. And obviously, we ask you a lot of sensible questions to make sure you understand the implications of what you're asking. And then you have to enter the account number. So 6507. And there we go. So much easier than it was before. So this is really, really helpful. You've just got to remember that step of unmanaging it if you're a control tower customer before. So yeah, that's kind of it from the account management point of view. Like, two really simple but really helpful changes. What I would add on to that is, if you are managing contacts manually and you're logging in your accounts and you're looking at doing that, that's a great first step, as I said, to do it through that centrally managed way. There's a blog post up around how to do this, what I call properly, around using the lifecycle events that get published to EventBridge. So there's a really detailed blog around how to do this. This will help you do that stuff automatically using the SDK, and then you don't have to worry about it at all. So if you're managing any of your alternate contacts manually today, great first step to do it in the console centrally, but look at automating that task so you don't have to bother, especially if you're generating a lot of accounts. And I mentioned the control tower guardrail around region deny. So previously, when we've worked with customers, we've helped them determine and manage service control policies that restrict AWS usage to regions they're operating in. Now, this is great, it gets people started, but what you actually have to do is you end up managing a bunch of the actions that need to happen more broadly than just the region. So the service control policy requires a lot more updating. What you get by putting it through a control tower guardrail is A, it's very, very easy to manage through control tower, but B, you get a bunch of that management taken out of it for you. So you can see here in the, this is just a screenshot off the documentation link at the bottom. You can see that all the different parts of the service control policy that need to run outside of the regions you're in, because they run globally, such as Cloudfront, they will get managed for you. So it's really, really simple. And with that, I will pass over to Brian.
Super smooth transition ensues. All right, so the first one I wanted to have a bit of a chat about tonight, pun intended, is a little bit around the AWS chatbot and some of the features that have recently been released there. So if, like me, you live in chat applications, specifically Slack, I love Slack, the chatbot is a really great service for being able to do things like A, push notifications to you. So usually when I've committed some code that has broken my pipeline, Slack is where I find out about that, because Code Pipeline will send me a thing saying, hey, this build failed. But the chatbot lets you do a whole lot more than that. And so recently there's been some updates to how it does interactions with your AWS account to essentially let you do pretty much anything that you can do from the AWS CLI from the chatbot. So this is really useful for scenarios where, maybe I'm on call over the weekend and I don't have my laptop in me, but I could fix something really easily with a quick chatbot command to start, say, a runbook in Systems Manager. I could just fire off a quick chat message from Slack in the mobile app, have it go and do the things, I can check the status and then be fine with it and not even have to open the laptop. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time tonight going through some stuff around the recent changes to the chatbot and how you can use that to make your life a little bit easier. So I'm going to flick over. Actually, what I might do first is I'll show a bit of demo first, and we'll go through some of what this looks like and how it feels, and then I'll show you the configuration. So here I've already got set up a channel called my ChatOps demo, where I've configured it to connect to my AWS account already. So I can go and start doing some really interesting things with it. So if I type just @AWS and fire that one off, it should come back with some useful information about things that it can go and do. So for example, I can start running things off as if I'm running the AWS CLI. So in much the same way as you would go AWS service operation and then put your parameters on the end, it's exactly the way you do it within the chatbot. So I don't need to remember a separate set of commands or anything. It's all exactly the same. So for example, CloudWatch describe alarms and show me everything that's in an alarm state. It will list those alarms back for me as a chat message from the bot. So I don't need to log into the AWS console, and I can do it from anywhere that my chatbot service is running. Another one that I'm a big fan of, and I would normally go through and demo, but I've kind of broken things to only be read-only in this account, and I didn't fix it before the start of the session. Things like creating a support case. So think of a scenario like this where I get a notification about an alarm in my AWS account, and I say, oh, that's bad. I need to engage AWS support to help me on this right now. From Slack, I could literally say, AWS support create case. And it'll then start prompting me for information like what is the subject of this, what is the body, and it'll go and create the support ticket for me. And then I can go and get to my laptop and start engaging with AWS support from there. But it's a really great way to kick things off quickly. So just as a bit of an example of how this is meant to work, I could say AWS S3, list objects v2 bucket, fun user group demo, and region. So in the same sort of format as working with AWS CLI, you can now see that I've put a couple of PowerPoint decks into that particular bucket. And it then says, hey, do you want to add some of the additional parameters onto this to start filtering the results down? And so it prompts you for ways to be able to interact with it better as you're using it, which again is super useful in terms of, I'm potentially on a mobile phone or a tablet and being able to interact with that. Now, in terms of how we drive that, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes sort of going through showing you some of the sort of security controls and ways that we work with this. So to start with, I've already connected it to my Slack workspace. So it adds itself as an app in Slack. You've got to grant permissions to be able to read channels and send messages and those kinds of things. Those are all controllable by a Slack administrator if you want to be able to limit that. But once we're in there, we can start listing out the individual channels. So again, here's the one that I've just set up. So you can see I've got a link to the actual channel. I can do logging, so logging of either just error messages or logging of everything that goes through. And so this will map the user IDs in Slack to the commands that they were running. Now, in terms of the permissions, it's important to understand how this works. So it's all still using IAM under the hood because IAM is the main way we authenticate into AWS accounts. Now, there are two different ways you can set up a channel, and I'm just going to edit this to show you the two different options and have a bit of a chat about them. So first of all, there is the channel IAM role option. So this is what was there when the chatbot service launched. It was the only way you could do things at first, where each Slack channel had a single IAM role, and anyone who was in that channel would leverage that role with everything that they did. So not really granular down to individual users. So it was sort of good for some use cases, but maybe not others. The recent change that went through switched to this idea of individual user roles. So what will happen the first time a user interacts with AWS in a specific channel is the chatbot will pop up and say, hey, can you tell me which IAM role you're meant to be using in this channel? And it takes you to the web browser, you choose your role, and it essentially maps your user ID in Slack to that particular IAM role, and it remembers that. So that way, if, for example, JJ and I were both in a channel, we could have individual IAM roles that are for us independently, as opposed to everybody having the same role. Now, as a way of protecting that a little bit further when you set this up, is you've got this ability to add channel guardrails. So this was also one of the recent changes that got added in here. So what a guardrail does is it essentially says, anything in this permission policy is doable, so you essentially end up with an overlap of the person's IAM permissions and the guardrail. So it overlaps the two, and the minimum set that is in both is what is actually doable. So say, for example, I choose the administrator role because I like over-permissioning things. Asterisks, don't do that. That's not a good security practice, but just for this example, let's say I choose the administrator role, but the guardrail says read-only. I'm only going to be able to do read-only commands, despite the fact that I chose the administrator role for myself. So this is a really great control for people who are administering connections to Slack to limit the things that can be done in Slack channels if that's something that your organization needs to do. So, like I said, that changed the permissionings model and the way we interact there. That was sort of the main piece of what we were doing. And with that, that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover off in regards to the Slack bot, chatbot for Slack. And I'm going to hand back over to JJ for some networking.
Thanks, Brian. We've got a few, so 3 broad categories here. The first of those is a really simple one for Amazon CloudFront. So Amazon CloudFront have now got a prefix list which allows customers to simplify some of the way they publish stuff to the internet. No, by that I mean when working with our customers, previously we've had to put a bit of effort into being able to manage limit the accessibility of the application, so your application origin, so lock it down so that requests can only come from CloudFront. This makes that way easier, and I'll have a bit more content on that in just a second. The second of those is the AWS Transit Gateway and some intra-region peering stuff, which allows you to connect 2 transit gateways within the same region, and I'll talk through a few use cases of that in a moment as well. And lastly, and I'll demo these 2 as well, is some IP address management. We now have an IP address management service, and also a network access analyzer capability within the VPC service that allows you to provide to apply some automated reasoning to your network configuration to be sure of what's happening in the environment. So the first of those was our IP prefixes. So there's a blog that you can look up if you want, but what we used to have to do was have a Lambda that ran that actually grabbed a published list of CloudFront addresses and allowed, and then from there you had to do some automation to update your the security in your system to restrict that access to CloudFront only, which meant there was just a few extra administrative steps you had to take to do it. And as you can see here, that blog now says, as of February 8 this year, this is just a bit easier. So that managed prefix now allows you much more easily in ways that we used to do similarly to how we configure DynamoDB and S3 endpoints in our route tables, to actually use a prefix list to have CloudFront origins defined much more simply, and it's managed for you rather than having to manage that additional Lambda and the automation. Now, what you see in front of you here is actually a page out of our documentation again, just around one of the gotchas for that. So the actual key here is around the weighting and the comments that I've highlighted in the pink box there for you. It counts as 55 rules in a security group. So if you have a large number of rules in your security group, you may bounce against that default quota of 60. You may need to get in contact with AWS support to get a quota increase. But yeah, it's a really simple little thing that just makes life a lot easier if you're using CloudFront to protect your internet-facing properties, which I really hope you are. The next one was transit gateways. What you see here, you don't need to take a lot of note of that architecture. It's actually one of the architectures from the linked blog post there. So transit gateways being able to peer within a region is really useful in the context of some of our customers here in a few different scenarios. So for example, my federal government customers, when we're doing things like machinery of government changes where we've got to move parts of the government around or do that, where their AWS environments need to be brought together, it's now much easier to do that at the networking layer than it was before, where we've had to do that. We can now do it by peering these gateways within a region. Separately, if you've got the need for team separation, which is a use case I've had in a couple of customers, where you might have a dedicated networking team and a cloud team, and you want to have a really clear administrative boundary between the two, I've seen patterns where we have customers running a transit gateway and a transit gateway, and previously you needed an intermediate layer of routers to decouple them. Now you can obviously peer those two, and that allows both teams to have the confidence in the configuration on their side, appropriate permissions to do the right level of action, but it allows freedom for the people working in cloud to use their transit gateway and their environment at the speed they want to use it. So there's a few use cases for that I've seen. I'd love to hear any more you've got in chat. But yeah, this is a super useful thing. And I can't emphasize this enough. If you're part of a networking team and you've got to think about this stuff, this blog is excellent. It's really detailed run through of a bunch of the different architectures and the considerations that you need to have when you're deploying this stuff within your environment. Now, one of the other things that's a little interesting for you is that it actually allows you to connect transit gateways across organizations. So you can do it between different organizations to do sort of faster connectivity as well. So it's super interesting. Read the blog. There's a lot in it. Now, let's get back into some more demo stuff. So let me just work my way to the account that I need. Let's have a look here. I am not in Ohio. Cool. So what we can see here, I'll just walk you through that. We have a control tower VPC here. Yep. And let me scroll fail. So the network access analyzer. So firstly, as long as this works, yep, cool, there we go. So what this allows you to do is it uses some technology from our automated reasoning group, which which provide formal mathematical proofs of a bunch of our stuff. So PIAs, the IAM access analyzer, the little bucket indicator in S3 that says whether or not it's public. That same team has worked on this feature that allows you to analyze your network configuration and figure out if it's compliant with what you're intending. Now, you can define rules, and I don't really have time to go through that for today, so I'm just going to walk through a couple of these are the ones that come out of the box from AWS, and these just straight out of the box, I can think of definitely useful as is for customers. So one of these is, can my instances egress through an internet gateway? Like, which of my instances can do that? Now, again, these take some time to run. So I've done this before previous to getting here, but what you end up with is it runs this. It checks all of the network interfaces in your environment, all of their possible paths that they can take through your infrastructure, and it figures out whether or not any of them can egress via an internet gateway. So that does take some time to run, but when you do it, it reports all of its findings into here. And so what we have, I might just zoom out just a little bit. You see that you get the internet, the ENI, the target internet gateway, but what's really neat is you actually get the path. So it will actually show you each and every step that that interface is taking to get from path A to path B. So if you're in a networking team or a security team and you want to be sure that instances that your cloud team say can't access the internet because you need them to be private, you've now got a way of checking that is very, very robust and allows you to understand exactly what network paths will allow that traffic and whether or not you've got any variance from your desired state. So this is really powerful. It was and something that I can see a lot of use cases for in my customers. The other one we had was the IP address manager. So just give me a second. Now, I've got a really simplistic demonstration of this one for you tonight, again, in the interests of time. This is quite deep. Like this, you can actually use your IP address manager to manage addresses across your entire organisation, and it allows you to get a view of what's in use, where your VPCs are busy, etc. And so what you do is you define some scopes and some IP pools. So for the purposes of this, we've got our demo pool here, which is just this 10/16 network range that I've put in there. You can dive in and it gives you some reporting on what has happened there. But importantly, it shows you all the resources that are in there and things like what's actually in use in that at the moment. So it's a very quick way to get a view. And if you imagine this scaled out across a decent sized organisation, it's a way to get on one single view, a view of where you've got VPCs that might be running out of IP addressing and where you've got space to take action. But one of the really, really neat things about this is it gives you the freedom to enable your development teams to deploy stuff. And so what do I mean by that? So it means in my IP address management, I can define as a network administrator a big block of network addresses. I can define the rules on how VPCs get created by default. And then what I can actually do when I can enable my development teams to go through a process where they create the VPC, let's say development team VPC, but I can get an IPAM allocated block. So now rather than having to put in a request, they can just automatically get these straight out of our IP address management system and they can get it, if I could scroll, and it allows them to deploy it straight away themselves. Oops. I can't actually ask for a VPC without a CIDR range. That's not surprising. We'll just ask for a simple /24, and then we'll try that. So yeah, super easy. So you can imagine as development teams now, rather than having that sort of razor job, do all this stuff, it's now much easier through AWS this way. For those of you that also had there were other systems that manage some of this stuff as well through the transit network orchestrator and things. This service makes a bunch of that visibility a lot easier. Definitely recommend having a look at it or telling your network team about it. And with that, I will throw back to Brian.
Fabulous. I've been sitting here laughing at JJ struggling to scroll. I literally have to invert the y-axis on every video game I play. It's just a thing I do. All right, let's talk developer stuff for a little bit. So, two services that have had some recent quality of life improvements that I wanted to talk through a little bit. First of all, updates for AWS Lambda. Now, the first one here was around support for ES modules and a top-level await for Node 14. And I'll flick across to a demo to give you a bit of an example of what that means and why it's important. And the second one was around function URLs. So this is super useful for anyone who wants to just call a URL and have a Lambda function run without having to set up an API gateway and all the things that go along with it. The second one that I'm going to go through is Amazon ECS, the Elastic Container Service. So if you're running container-based workloads, chances are you've either dealt with ECS or EKS for a Kubernetes-flavored version of that. Recent updates to ECS that, again, make developing container workloads easier. First of all, so they both relate to ECS exec. So this is a simple way to be able to issue commands to run against your specific Docker containers. So this leverages the session manager feature of the AWS Systems Manager. And feature updates for this are, firstly, that we now support it for Windows containers. Right? So if you've been containerizing your Windows workloads, like your .NET applications and those kinds of things, you can now use ECS exec as well. And the second one is that it's now been integrated directly into Visual Studio Code. So if you want to go and execute commands against your containers, you can do so directly from within your IDE, which makes troubleshooting and working with them really, really easy. So let's flick across and start with a few of the Lambda updates. So first of all, I've got a function here, user group demo, very straightforward, and I'm just going to zoom that up a little bit while we talk about it. So this is using the version 14 of the Node runtime. And so the couple of things that I want to talk about here that were added to Node 14 that we've brought into Lambda here as well. It ties into being able to support ES modules and appropriate syntax there. So the eagle-eyed among you might have actually noticed that I've used the file extension mechanism here to flag this as an ES module. So instead of a .js file, I have a .mjs file. So that tells the interpreter that this should be treated as an ES module, and I can use the same syntax elements that go within that. You can also have things compile out to modules and do things in all sorts of different ways. Now, that's useful because it enables us to do a couple of different syntax things here that you couldn't previously do in Node.js. And as simple as it looks, it's actually just this line here, this being able to await something outside of the top-level function. So for those who aren't familiar with the way Node.js does asynchronous programming, it uses this mechanism called promises to say, I've got something and it's going to run, and at the end of that, it'll either succeed or fail, and you can take actions accordingly on that, right? The await keyword is a way of saying, I want you to go and do that thing, but I'm not going to progress the execution here until that's finished. Now, previously, you couldn't await something at the top level. It had to be inside of a function. So I would take that, maybe I would take this line from here and I would shove it into the start of my handler like that. That would be valid under the previous regime. Now, the reason this is important is if we start thinking about Lambda functions that might need to do things like pre-cached data. Right? So say, for example, I've got some data in S3 or Dynamo or some other storage mechanism, and it needs to cache a bunch of that inside of the Lambda runtime so that every subsequent call to Lambda can work with that. Now, previously, I could just go through and put my await inside of the handler, and the very first time that Lambda function gets invoked, it'll go and do the things and store the variables and work with that the way it needs to work with it. But the problem there is that when it came to things like troubleshooting it, I wasn't able to then understand the difference between the things that were loading that were caching data as well as things that were running inside of the handler itself. By separating it out, I get a really clear syntax view of things that are the actual handler that need to run on every event, as well as things that I want to await for before it actually starts. And so you'll actually see that if you go into like X-Ray or your CloudWatch Insights, you'll see the time it takes essentially through that first cold start and invocation time, as well as the actual function runtime there as well. So this is just a really nice little quality of life improvement that makes it easier to understand the performance of different elements of your Lambda functions and have cleaner syntax that makes more logical sense. So despite the fact that my await function here is not actually doing anything useful, I can just go through and run that, and for all intents and purposes, it just does what it needs to do. So if I went into CloudWatch, I could pull out some of those metrics and show you that separation. But now the next thing that I wanted to talk about was function URLs. So there's a really common scenario where customers need to, for like webhooks and integration with webhooks, want to have a Lambda function that runs in response to a webhook. Now, typically the pattern for that would have been I would set up an API gateway. I would then need to associate my Lambda function with a particular path there. I would need to do function policies to make sure API gateway can invoke Lambda and go through a bunch of that kind of setup. I'm then also paying for API gateway on top of the Lambda resources as well. Right? It's not a lot of money, but it is an additional overhead. Now, what function URLs are designed for is if you want to be able to make a HTTP request to invoke your Lambda function, but you don't want to have to set up API gateway. I just want a really minimal set of, give me a URL, I'm going to go and invoke this function and be done with it. That's what function URLs are for. So now, if you scroll over to the configuration tab in your Lambda function, you'll see there's this new section here, function URL. So let's go through and create a function URL. Now, you get two types of authentication. I can go for none, which it means it's publicly accessible. Right? There's no authentication on this in any way, shape, or form. If you do this, make sure that you implement some sort of authorization logic in your code, like look for a specific header as like a key value or something. Otherwise, your Lambda function can just run and anyone can call it, and that's something you need to be aware of. You've also got an option of using IAM authentication. So you can sign the request in the same way as any other IAM request gets signed, and you go and do it with that. Now, for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to say none. I've also got the option to incorporate access for CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. Now, anyone who's ever written an API application from like a JavaScript web application at some point has dealt with CORS and has some point screamed bloody murder at the computer as a result of dealing with CORS. To really simplify that, what we've built into the UI here is the ability to specify the CORS headers in place here with your Lambda function so that it automatically appends those headers without you needing to make any additional configuration. So it's all very easy to do. But once you've done that, I can press save, and ta-da, I now have a function URL. If I click that, it opens in a new tab, and you can see the output there. Hello from Lambda. So there's my raw data that is the body. So if you look at the response format in terms of what I was spitting back out, it spits out a response that is in the same format as what API Gateway expects. I can spit out a status code, the body, additional headers that go on the response. That same structure of data object gets returned out of a function URL. So in this case, the body is literally just that text of hello Lambda, but it's gone and invoked that Lambda function for me. And that makes it a really, really easy way to go and work with Lambda. And if after that you decide you're done, as I'm going to do just to make sure that nobody manipulates that anonymous URL endpoint, ta-da, cleaned up, that easy. One of the things you will notice after you set these up manually is it does add a function URL public access policy. So you get that resource-based policy added for you automatically. If you're doing this through infrastructure as code, you need to make sure that you include that. Now, the second developer thing I wanted to go into was a little bit of ECS exec, and specifically the Visual Studio Code integration, which I'm swiping the wrong way for. Come back, VS Code. There we go. So hopefully if you're using Visual Studio Code, you've gone and installed the AWS extension, because that gives you a whole bunch of really great things, particularly if you're building CDK apps. The Explorer there is nice. But this AWS Explorer is a really nice way to be able to interact with resources in your account. So in this particular case, let's say that I've got an ECS cluster. In this case, I know it's running in Singapore. And I'm going to open this up, and you can see here I've got a cluster with a task and individual containers in that task. And now, If I wanted to go through and run commands in that container, I could go to the CLI and start specifying, all right, I need to look up the container and the cluster and put all the parameters together for that and run my commands. Doable, but it's a bit fiddly, right? Now, I can literally just right click on here, and that text is very small, so you might not be able to see it, but it just says run command in container. So when I do that, it spins up a little workflow that appears at the top of the screen here. So first of all, it says, okay, pick which one of the tasks you want to execute this against. So in this particular case, my service, it's running a Grafana instance at this point, has two different tasks. So we're running two instances of the container for high availability, so I could pick one or the other. Then it says, what command would you like to run? So let's give it something really basic. I just list everything at the root. And then it says, excellent. This may modify the container. Are you sure? Yes or no? I'm going to say yes, and off you go. So you can see here the output is actually very similar to the Session Manager plugin. In fact, if you try to run this without installing the Session Manager plugin, it will prompt you to do so. So it's using the same technology as AWS Session Manager to be able to connect into that running instance, execute your command, and bring you the result. So that there is the result of that command, and I haven't had to leave my IDE to do anything with it. Now, I can't run an interactive command in this one yet. So for example, if you wanted to go and do something with Bash, you go back to the old school, specify the ARN of your cluster and your task, and I put -- interactive on it. This will work with the Windows container as well, but again, once I do that, I could go through and be in my Windows or my Linux containers and start running Bash commands like I was just doing and getting output of those and interacting with my containers really easily within that IDE of Visual Studio Code. Last thing to highlight on that as well is that same function and feature behaves in exactly the same way in AWS Cloud 9. So if you're using Cloud 9 as a web-based IDE, you can do everything that I just showed you there in Cloud 9 as well as in VS Code. All right, and to bring it home, I'm going to hand back to JJ for the last section.
Thank you, Brian, of the wonky scrolling. Very good. Okay, so I have got a few little things sort of in the EC2 realm with a few others. Systems Manager came out a little while ago with this nicely integrated SSO console access, which I'll actually give you a bit of a demo of soon as well. But a couple of the other little things are really quite neat. So in almost every customer since I started at AWS, I've had to have a conversation around instance auto recovery for important instances in their environment. So what that means, it used to be something that you set up, and if the underlying hardware disappeared, blew up, had some kind of failure, it would automatically bring up the instance on some other hardware. Now it just happens by default. So that's a great win for customers, and just something that people need to be aware of. If it was built into your workflow for some of your instances or some of your code, you just don't have to do it anymore. Really, really nice little improvement. Another one is the instance tags, which are now available by the metadata service. And my first response in looking at this was to sort of raise an eyebrow and ask, okay, so why is that interesting? And what it actually means is that when you're on your instance, you no longer have to call the describe instances API, to get the tags. You don't have to do any sort of code like that. It's all available in the metadata service. And for environments with large amounts of instances, that can really lower the number of API calls you've got. And some of my customers have had their API calls throttled in that regard. And just by doing this, when I thought through it, I thought that's actually a really, really nice little way to take away a whole bunch of those API calls that would just effectively tell me my tags, understand where I am. So really, really nice little improvement there. An EC2 image builder. For those of you who've managed image pipelines before, you've probably had some sort of workflow that involved notifications and publishing central AMIs out to different child accounts. All of that's vastly simpler now. You can now just share it out via RAM through organisations, and any account in your organisation that you decide can now get access to your centrally published AMIs. Really, really helpful little thing to just improve quality of life has been the theme tonight. And our image builder also now supports on-premises images. So you can do things like upload your VMware image to S3 and use that in your EC2 image builder workflows. So again, nice little thing to help you get a consistent environment in there. But let's have a quick dive into the integrated console access. So let me go here and launch Systems Manager. Now, there are a few prerequisites with this one. You've got to have Systems Manager set up. You've got to be able to do a few things there. They've got to be visible in, visible in Fleet Manager. So all going well. I am in Sydney. There we go. You can see that I've got a couple of test instances here. Now, this is just a very basic setup tonight, but you can do this with all of those. But in that node, you can now actually start a connection with remote desktop, just like you used to be able to before. But what you've now got is this option. You can now log in via single sign-on. And so using AWS SSO, you can now connect. And demo God's willing, it will actually connect you to the remote desktop and allow you to manage your workstation. So what this does, if you think about it, is it allows you to get rid of the need for Bastion hosts and other remote management things and have it nicely integrated with SSO. So as you can see here, it logs on quite nicely. I've got an hour to do my remote management, it's logging on as Brian. Cool. So this is where I realised that in our previous demos, oh, that's hilarious. That's all good. So I will do this now. And oops. And this will test my, I always get this URL wrong, so watch as I fail gloriously. Just wait for PowerShell to kick off. There we go. Latest / meta. Ooh, what have I done? Oh, there we go. Slash. Lastest. Nice. There we go. Okay, cool. So now what you can do, as I said before, you can have a look through your tags and you can see there I've created a tag called user group is great, which of course it is. And so now from the scripts on your host, you can access all of those. Now, the trick with this is you need to enable it on your instance. So you can do it at deploy time. You can set that that they're available, but let me just quickly show you where we do that. Let me just find EC2. No, I'm not in the right account. Thank you, sir. Nice, well played, Hyland. EC2, if we have a look in our instances, my Windows instance, you can now say actions. If I can scroll, you can see here there's an option that says allow tags in instance metadata. So if you've got an existing instance where you are looking up tags regularly from the instance itself, you can enable it there, but it's also part of your run instances launch API call. You can actually set this by default when you're deploying new instances. So yeah, that's kind of our last one then, everyone. That's just a really simple way to help make some of your automation that little bit easier. And in terms of that, that's kind of all we have for tonight. Now, as I said at the start, this is an experimental talk approach. Brian and I are going to be around for a while. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this format. We've got a vast resource of talented people in AWS that we can bring in for either for some tales from the field or some of those sorts of little insights like this. If you like the format or you like the style, let us know and we'll slot one into the schedule periodically. But yeah, we'll be around in chat. We'd love to share, have some ideas thrown at us, and we're more than happy to take feedback on this one, team. And lastly, I promised earlier some exciting news. Brian and I are just in the last steps of dotting some I's and crossing some T's. Next month, we should be here in the AWS office in person. So, hooray! AWS user group should be back in person. We'll have the usual drinks, pizzas, that sort of stuff. We're hoping, fingers crossed, to have some swag giveaways as well. So please stay tuned to the meetup group. We'll announce it all in there. But yeah, fingers crossed, our May edition of the user group will hopefully be in person here in the office in Canberra City. So very, very exciting time to have all of you here in the office for the first time. Yeah, and for those of you who aren't in Canberra, then we will try. What we're aiming to do as a part of this is actually keep the stream going. So you'll have the same setup here, the same view. You'll unfortunately lose me as I walk around the room as I'm talking to people, but we'll do our best to get that in a way. And I'm sure Brian and I will come up with a handful of ways to fail gloriously with technical details as we go through it. But we're very, very excited, as you can probably tell, to see you all face to face again and do this in person. So please tell us what you want to see. Tell us what you like. Get your pizza orders in. No, do that. Spread the word. Let's have a huge event next month, assuming we can get in person. Let's get everyone here and really get this community back together again. That would be great. And with that, please, feedback, fill out your session feedback in Meetup. We do read it all, and Brian and I are both super excited to hopefully be welcoming you to the new Canberra office next month for AWS Canberra User Group. Thanks so much, and have a great night.